In 1978, a toddler fell through an unguarded gap on a 12-foot slide in Chicago and hit the asphalt head first. The slide had no railing. The ground had no padding. The manufacturer had no obligation to fix it. Here are 30 of the wildest 1970s playground hazards that no school would allow now. Metal slides were standard equipment at every elementary school in the 1970s, and every kid who climbed one in July learned the same lesson the hard way. The sliding surface was galvanized steel, a single sheet of metal bolted to a frame, angled steeply with nothing but open air on the sides. On a summer afternoon, direct sunlight could push that surface past 130 degrees, hot enough to raise blisters on bare legs in seconds. You went down fast, or you got burned. There was no shade canopy, no plastic coating, no temperature warning. Just raw, sun-baked metal that the school considered perfectly functional. At the bottom, the exit ramp often ended abruptly, dumping riders onto packed dirt or asphalt with no deceleration zone at all. The CPSC would later acknowledge that even modern plastic slides can reach dangerous temperatures, but the all-steel versions of the decade made that hazard exponentially worse. If you fell off anything on a 1970s playground, the ground was not going to help you. Across the country, the standard surface under swings, slides, and climbing bars was either poured asphalt, concrete slab, or hard-packed dirt trampled into something nearly as solid. A 1994 survey by the U.S. Public Interest Research Group examined 443 playgrounds nationwide and found that 92% lacked adequate shock-absorbing surfacing. The report concluded that a fall onto concrete from as low as 2 inches could produce a life-threatening head injury in a child. 2 inches. The entire concept of impact-attenuating ground cover, wood chips, rubber mulch, poured rubber, did not exist in standard practice. The CPSC would not publish its first surfacing recommendations until 1981, a full decade after the agency was created. Every fall from every piece of equipment ended the same way, on a surface that gave back exactly as much force as it received. The swings at your neighborhood park were not the molded rubber seat, limited arc models that exist today. In the 1970s, a swing set meant a heavy steel A-frame bolted into concrete footings, with thick steel chains suspending either a flat wooden plank or a rigid rubber belt. The chains alone could pinch skin or catch hair if you shifted wrong at the peak of the arc. The connection points were open gaps wide enough to trap a small finger. Closed S-hook hardware was not standard. Getting clipped by an empty swing returning on its arc was like being struck by a steel-framed pendulum, because that is exactly what it was. Kids routinely stood on the seats, twisted the chains into tight spirals and released them to spin, or jumped at full height to see who could stick the landing. The ground below was bare dirt or concrete. Nobody measured the arc radius, and nobody posted weight limits. Before the CPSC ever published a height guideline, jungle gyms in American schoolyards regularly reached 12 feet or higher. Some catalog models from companies like Narragansett Machine Company topped 14. The bars were tubular steel, cold and slick from morning dew or rain, and the spacing between rungs was not standardized. A small child's foot or head could slip through gaps that were never tested for entrapment. A study published in the Journal of Accident Analysis and Prevention found that kids were twice as likely to sustain serious injuries when falling from heights above 5 feet. The average 1970s jungle gym exceeded that threshold by a factor of 2. There was no safety netting, no enclosed platform at the top, and the landing zone was whatever surface the school happened to have, usually asphalt or packed earth with no cushioning properties whatsoever. But while the jungle gym at least stayed in place, the merry-go-round was a hazard that moved. The standard playground model of the 1970s was a flat steel platform, sometimes 10 to 16 feet in diameter, mounted on a center post and spun entirely by hand. There were no speed governors, no braking mechanisms, and no limit on how fast older kids or adults could push the thing. Miracle Recreation Equipment Company of Grinnell, Iowa, one of the largest playground manufacturers in the country, sold merry-go-rounds by the thousands. The CPSC later sued Miracle for its bounce-around whirl and buckaroo whirl models, after discovering that the rotating platform crossed over stationary supports with extremely narrow clearance, creating a shearing mechanism that could trap and crush small fingers. Miracle had received numerous injury claims but failed to report them as required by the Consumer Product Safety Act. The company only disclosed the defect after a federal inspection forced the issue. The steel teeter-totter had a brutal design flaw built into its core purpose. Two kids sat on opposite ends of a steel plank balanced on a center fulcrum, and the only way it worked was if both riders cooperated. If one jumped off without warning, the other dropped straight down, and the steel plank slammed into the ground with full gravitational force plus the rider's weight. There was no shock absorber, no rubber bumper, and no cushion at the bottom of the arc. The impact point was typically a metal crossbar striking packed earth or concrete, and the child on top absorbed the entire jolt through the base of the spine. The fulcrum mechanism itself was a pinch point. Small fingers could get caught between the moving plank and the stationary support post. Most models also had steel handles that could crack a jaw if the rider pitched forward on a hard landing. The design went unchanged from the 1920s through the late 1970s. Monkey bars were responsible for more serious injuries on public playgrounds than any other piece of equipment, according to CPSC data from the era, and the 1970s version was designed to maximize that risk. The overhead ladder was tubular steel mounted at a height that left the average second grader's feet 6 to 8 feet off the ground. The bars were smooth, round, and offered no grip texture. A sweaty palm on a summer afternoon meant a lost hold and a straight drop. The spacing between rungs was set for an adult stride but too wide for most kids under 8, which forced them to swing their full body weight to reach each bar. 3/4 of all playground injuries in the 1970s and 80s resulted from falls to the surface, and monkey bars generated more of those falls than any other single structure. No one installed padding below. No one lowered the height. No one asked whether a first grader should share the same equipment as a sixth grader. In 1973, the Recreation Equipment Company advertised its Super Spiral slide as providing an exciting spiraling ride with a strong bucket-shaped sliding surface and high sides holding its riders safely in the center. That description was generous. The Spiral Tornado slide was a tightly wound steel chute that corkscrewed downward from heights of 8 to 12 feet, accelerating riders through narrow turns where arms and legs could jam against the walls at speed. Centrifugal force pushed small bodies toward the outer edge, and the low side walls on many models were not high enough to keep a child from tipping over mid-spiral. In summer, the enclosed metal curves concentrated solar radiation, and the steel surface could reach temperatures that left friction burns on bare skin. These slides sat in schoolyards across the country for years, and the CPSC had no published standard to measure them against. Tire swings looked harmless, just an old car tire hung from chains on a steel frame. But a standard tire filled with standing rainwater and packed mud could weigh over 80 pounds, and once it started swinging, it carried devastating momentum. The CPSC documented more than 40 reported cases of serious head injuries caused by tire swings on public playgrounds and eventually pushed hard for their removal. The danger extended well beyond the rider. Any child who wandered into the swing radius while the tire was in motion had almost no time to react before impact. The rubber itself was a secondary hazard. Real tires degraded in ultraviolet light, cracking along the sidewall and producing jagged edges. They also trapped standing water inside the cavity, turning each swing into a mosquito breeding ground. And because tires were typically hung from a single attachment point, they swung in unpredictable circular and elliptical arcs rather than a fixed back-and-forth path. The wooden seesaw was the teeter-totter's rougher, older cousin, and by the mid-1970s it was falling apart on playgrounds across the country. The planks were untreated softwood, pine or fir, that splintered along the grain after a few seasons of sun, rain, and heavy use. Sitting on the seat meant dragging bare thighs across a surface embedded with wood fibers sharp enough to draw blood through a pair of shorts. The bolts holding the plank to the fulcrum rusted in place, and the pivot mechanism developed a grinding wobble that made the whole structure lurch unpredictably. Steel handles welded to the plank collected rainwater that accelerated corrosion until the grip was nothing but rough oxidized metal. The deeper hazard was structural failure. A weathered plank could snap mid-ride without warning, dropping one rider to the ground and catapulting the other. Schools rarely inspected equipment on any regular schedule, and if a plank cracked, it stayed cracked until someone complained. If the exposed steel and splintering wood were the dangers you could see, the arsenic was the one you could not. Starting in the 1970s, playground builders across the country switched to pressure-treated lumber for wooden structures. Forts, climbing walls, balance beams, and swing-set frames. The preservative was chromated copper arsenate, a chemical cocktail of chromium, copper, and arsenic that prevented rot and insect damage. It worked perfectly for that purpose. It also leached carcinogenic arsenic onto the surface of the wood, where it transferred directly to the hands of every child who gripped a railing or climbed a post. EPA data from 2003 showed that 90% of kids repeatedly exposed to CCA-treated playground wood faced a cancer risk above the agency's own threshold of concern. The wood carried a faint greenish tint, but no warning label and no indication that the surface held a known carcinogen. CCA-treated lumber was not phased out of residential playground use until 2004, 3 full decades after it became the industry standard. Swinging gates were never the centerpiece of any playground. They were the forgotten piece of equipment tucked near the entrance or along a fence line. A metal gate hung on a pivot post, and kids would stand on the bottom rail and ride the arc back and forth like a low-speed pendulum. The problem was the hinge. The gap between the gate's moving frame and the stationary post narrowed as the gate swung shut, creating a crushing point that could trap fingers, hands, or a small wrist between two pieces of steel. There was no guard plate, no hinge cover, no mechanism to slow the closing action. The CPSC would later classify pinch points and shearing mechanisms as primary hazard categories in playground equipment, but during the 1970s, the swinging gate had no safety classification at all. It was just a gate. Schools kept them because they were cheap and functional, and nobody thought to file a complaint until a child got hurt. The animal swings that hung from steel A-frames across American playgrounds in the 1970s were not the lightweight, spring-mounted bouncers that replaced them. These were full-sized swing seats molded or welded into the shapes of horses, dolphins, and rockets, cast from heavy-gauge steel or dense plastic and suspended on long chains. A single animal swing could weigh 40 to 60 pounds empty. Once in motion, the mass and chain length gave it an arc wide enough to strike anyone standing within 6 feet. Over time, the painted surfaces chipped and peeled, exposing bare metal edges underneath. The paint itself was often lead-based, applied before the 1978 federal ban on lead in residential coatings, which meant the colorful flakes kids picked at were toxic. No warning was posted on the frame. No weight rating was stamped anywhere on the structure. The giant stride was one of the oldest and most dangerous contraptions still found on American playgrounds at the start of the decade. A tall steel pole, 12 to 15 feet high, was anchored in concrete, with chains or ropes dangling from a rotating hub at the top. Kids grabbed a chain, sprinted in a circle, and launched themselves off the ground, swinging outward at increasing speed as the hub spun faster. With multiple riders going at once, collisions were constant and unpredictable. The CPSC placed the giant stride on its official list of equipment not recommended for public playgrounds. The National Recreation Association had first called for its removal back in 1921, and after a child died in rural Pennsylvania in 1924, school officials demanded that teachers lock the equipment when not supervised. But the giant stride survived for another 50 years in parks where budgets were tight and nobody enforced the recommendation. If the giant stride was dangerous because of speed, the barrel of fun was dangerous because of physics itself. Hill Standard marketed this steel drum as a mechanical greased pig, a 140-pound barrel mounted horizontally on a pole, anchored into a poured concrete slab 2 feet off the ground. Kids were supposed to grip the barrel and hang on while it spun, attempt somersaults over the top, or try running along the surface like a log roller. The barrel's smooth steel exterior was specifically designed to prevent snagging, which also meant there was nothing to hold on to once momentum built up. A child who lost grip at speed was launched sideways onto the concrete pad below. There was no padding, no sand pit, no rubber surface. The barrel of fun appeared in catalogs well into the 1970s, and no manufacturer ever issued a recall. Lawn darts were never officially playground equipment, but they showed up at school field days, church picnics, and backyard barbecues throughout the 1970s and early 80s. Sold under the brand name Jarts, each set included 4 12-inch steel-tipped projectiles with plastic fins weighted to arc through the air and stick point first into the ground. Between 1978 and 1986, lawn darts sent over 6,000 people to emergency rooms, 75% of them under 15. In April of 1987, 7-year-old Michelle Snow was struck in the head by a dart in Riverside, California. She died 3 days later. Her father, David Snow, spent 18 months lobbying Congress and the CPSC. The ban took effect in December of 1988. During the very week the commission voted, an 11-year-old girl in Tennessee was hit by a dart and fell into a coma. No recall was ever issued for the millions of sets already in garages and sheds across the country. Miracle Recreation Equipment Company built some of the most iconic playground structures of the era, and the rocket slide was the showpiece. A fully enclosed steel tower shaped like a space capsule, standing 10 to 15 feet tall, with a metal slide spiraling out of the top. Kids climbed a ladder inside the dark cabin, which had small porthole windows and a steel floor that amplified every footstep into a metallic echo. On a summer day, the enclosed shell acted like an oven. The interior temperature could soar far above the outside air, and every surface a child touched was bare metal, conducting that heat directly into small hands. The slide exiting the top was the same galvanized steel as every other slide on the playground, only now the rider launched from greater height with more speed. Miracle sold hundreds of rocket slides to schools and parks nationwide without a single heat advisory. Chain link climbing nets were strung between steel poles or laid across playground frames, and they looked like something borrowed from a military obstacle course, because they essentially were. The nets were made from steel chain or heavy rope with openings large enough for a small body to slip through. The real danger was entanglement. Drawstrings from hoodies, scarves, and loose clothing could catch in the chain links as a child moved through, and if the fabric tightened around the neck, the child's own body weight created the force. The CPSC documented multiple deaths from entanglement on playground equipment involving ropes, chains, and leashes throughout the decade. No manufacturer included a warning about loose clothing, and no school posted guidelines about what kids should wear while climbing. The witch's hat, also called the ocean wave, was a spinning, swaying metal platform shaped like an inverted cone, balanced on a central pole with a universal joint that allowed it to move in every direction simultaneously. Up to 40 kids could pile onto the outer rim, gripping whatever handhold existed, while the structure rotated and oscillated at the same time. When the witch's hat built up speed, the combined forces were strong enough to fling smaller riders off the edge entirely. In Britain, 5 kids died on witch's hat equipment in a single year, according to the Financial Times. The American versions were no safer. Riders who fell inward slammed into the center pole, and those who fell outward hit concrete or packed dirt. The witch's hat was quietly pulled from most playgrounds by the early 1980s, but no formal ban was ever issued in the United States. It simply disappeared. The witch's hat at least had the excuse of being a relic from an older era. Trapeze bars and exercise rings were deliberately installed on 1970s playgrounds as fitness equipment for kids, and they operated on the assumption that a child who fell simply needed to learn a better grip. The bars were smooth steel tubes mounted 8 to 10 feet off the ground, suspended from chains attached to an overhead beam. Kids were expected to swing from bar to bar, hang upside down, or attempt flips, all over bare ground with no mat, no sand, and no spotter. Free swinging ropes attached to some units posed an additional strangulation hazard, as fraying fibers could loop around a neck during a dismount. The CPSC would later recommend removing trapeze bars from public playgrounds entirely, citing the combination of height, momentum, and hard landing surfaces as consistently dangerous. Spring-mounted rocking horses and their cousins, the rocking boats, rocking cars, and rocking motorcycles, sat on heavy coil springs bolted to a concrete pad and bounced back and forth when a child shifted their weight. The design was simple and the appeal was immediate. The problem was the spring. The coil was exposed industrial-grade steel with gaps between the coils wide enough to catch a small finger, a shirt hem, or a shoelace. When the rider rocked forward, the spring compressed and those gaps closed with crushing force, a pinch point that could trap anything caught between the coils. The mounting hardware was equally hazardous, with bolts protruding from a base plate and a concrete anchor pad often raised above ground level. If a bigger kid stood at the rear and rocked hard, the whole unit could tip far enough to slam the rider's face into the mounting surface. No speed limiter, no tilt stop, no safety envelope of any kind. In neighborhoods where the park's budget ran thin, playground equipment was whatever the crew could find. Concrete drainage pipes, culverts left over from road construction, were half buried in the ground and offered to kids as tunnels. These were not purpose-built play structures. They were industrial infrastructure repurposed without modification. The interior was raw concrete with rough aggregate that scraped bare knees and elbows on contact. There was no ventilation, and on hot days, the air inside became stifling. Standing water pooled at the low point after every rain. The openings were wide enough for a child to enter, but narrow enough that two kids meeting in the middle could get wedged. No one measured the interior diameter against a child's shoulder width. No one checked for cracking or structural failure. The pipes just sat there year after year in parks where the choice was concrete tunnels or nothing. In 1978, a boy named Frank Nelson climbed to the top of a 12-foot tornado slide in Hamlin Park on the northwest side of Chicago. His mother, Deborah, was a few steps behind him. The slide had been installed 3 years earlier and had a gap between the handrail and the steps, a gap wide enough for a small child to fall through. Frank went through it head first and landed on the asphalt below. He fractured his skull and suffered permanent brain damage. He lost the use of his left side and developed lasting speech and vision problems. His attorneys would later note that he was forced to wear a protective helmet for the rest of his life. The family sued the Chicago Park District and the manufacturer. In January of 1985, a court granted Frank a settlement that could reach as high as $29.8 million over his lifetime. The manufacturer had already quietly added a second railing to the slide after his fall, an acknowledgement that the original design was flawed from the start. Every steel jungle gym, every swing frame, every slide, and every merry-go-round on a 1970s playground was coated in paint, and much of that paint contained lead. Before the federal government banned lead-based paint for residential use in 1978, it was the standard finish for outdoor metal structures because it resisted weather and corrosion better than alternatives. On a playground, that meant every chipped railing, every peeling slide bed, and every flaking handrail left behind particles of a neurotoxin that kids inhaled, touched, and transferred to their mouths without knowing it. The CPSC later published specific recommendations for identifying and controlling lead paint on public playground equipment, but by then, the exposure had been ongoing for decades. Lead does not break down in soil. The paint chips that fell onto the ground beneath the swings and slides mixed into the dirt where kids played, sat, and dug with their hands every single day. Many of those playgrounds were in lower-income communities, where replacement equipment was the last line item in any municipal budget. What made all of this possible was a single regulatory gap that lasted for nearly a decade. The Consumer Product Safety Commission was established in 1972 with a mandate to protect American families from dangerous products, but the agency did not publish its first handbook for public playground safety until 1981. For 9 years, the federal agency charged with keeping kids safe had no official position on how high a slide should be, what kind of surface should be underneath it, how wide the gaps between bars could be, or whether a piece of equipment designed for a teenager was appropriate for a 5-year-old. Manufacturers operated in a vacuum. Schools bought whatever was cheapest. Parks departments installed whatever fit. And when the handbook finally arrived, it carried no legal force. The CPSC issued guidelines, not regulations. Compliance was voluntary. A school could read every recommendation and choose to do nothing, and no federal agency had the authority to stop them. The CPSC did not only fail to act quickly. In at least one case, it had to drag a manufacturer into court to get basic information about known dangers. The agency filed a complaint against Miracle Recreation Equipment Company after discovering that the firm's bounce-around whirl and buckaroo whirl merry-go-rounds contained a shearing defect in the platform mechanism. As the carousel spun, the rotating steel surface crossed over stationary supports with almost no clearance, a gap narrow enough to trap and crush a child's fingers. Miracle had received a substantial number of injury claims related to this exact mechanism, but did not report them to the CPSC as required by the Consumer Product Safety Act. The company only came forward after federal investigators conducted an on-site inspection of the Grinnell, Iowa plant. The CPSC sought civil penalties. Miracle had sold thousands of these units to schools and parks from coast to coast, and every single one carried the same defect. Among the most chilling hazards on a 1970s playground were the gaps, the spaces between bars, between railings and platforms, between steps and handrails, that nobody measured against the size of a child's head. Head entrapment occurs when a child's body fits through an opening but the head does not, or when the head enters a gap that narrows and locks around the neck. The CPSC documented deaths from entrapment and entanglement throughout the decade, including cases involving ropes, leashes, and clothing that caught on protruding hardware. But the physical gaps in the equipment itself were the structural cause. No manufacturer tested openings against a child-sized head gauge. No installer measured the distance between components after assembly. The 1981 handbook would eventually address entrapment as a primary hazard category. But every structure built before that year was designed without any reference to the dimensions of the bodies that would use it. The term fall zone did not exist in playground design during the 1970s. There was no defined perimeter around a swing, slide, or climbing structure where the ground had to be clear and the surface had to be soft. Equipment was installed edge to edge, with a merry-go-round 5 feet from a swing set and a slide emptying directly into the path of a seesaw. The CPSC's own research found that 3/4 of all playground injuries resulted from falls, not from equipment failure, not from collisions, but from hitting the ground. And the ground gave no quarter. The 1981 handbook would eventually define use zones and recommend minimum clearances, but in the decade before, a child thrown from a spinning merry-go-round could land on asphalt, on another piece of equipment, or on another child, and the layout of the playground made all 3 outcomes equally likely. The structures were placed for convenience, not for the safety of the kids who moved between them. Not a single piece of playground equipment sold in the 1970s carried an age recommendation. There was no label that said, "For ages 5 to 12." There was no sign at the entrance to a play area separating the toddler section from the older kid section, because those sections did not exist. A 3-year-old and a 13-year-old used the same 12-foot jungle gym, the same high-speed merry-go-round, and the same steel chain swing set. The toddler section, now a standard feature of every modern playground, was a concept that did not enter playground design until the CPSC's guidelines took hold in the late 1980s. For the entire decade before, the smallest kids on the playground shared equipment that was sized, weighted, and mounted for bodies twice their height. No manufacturer considered developmental stages. No school separated play areas by age. The equipment was one size fits all, and the youngest paid the highest price. By the time the CPSC published its first playground safety handbook in 1981, the agency's own tracking system estimated that American emergency rooms were treating roughly 156,000 playground-related injuries every year. That number did not go down. It kept climbing. The annual figure eventually passed 200,000. More than 500 kids a day, every day, arriving at hospitals with broken bones, fractured skulls, crushed fingers, and concussions from equipment that was still considered acceptable by every school district and parks department in the country. The handbook offered guidance. The ASTM published voluntary standards in 1993. But there was no federal law that required compliance, no mandatory inspection, and no penalty for a school that kept a rusted, lead-painted, arsenic-treated, gap-riddled jungle gym standing on bare asphalt for another decade. The playground of the 1970s was not a failure of imagination, it was a failure of accountability, and the kids who played on it were the ones who absorbed the cost. Morning announcements in the 1970s sometimes sounded more like sermons than school updates. Many schools began the day with Christian prayers broadcast over the intercom. Teachers and students of other faiths, or none, were expected to bow their heads and participate. It was tradition, they said, a way to start the day right. A hush would fall over the classroom as the principal's voice echoed through the speaker, reading verses before the pledge. Some students faked reverence to avoid standing out, while others truly believed they were doing something good. For those who did not share the faith, the silence was heavy, a mix of isolation and quiet resentment. But for many, it was a quiet reminder that religion and public education were still deeply tangled. Children who hesitated were called out or told they lacked respect. It would take court cases and years of social change before those prayers were fully banned. The intercom that once echoed with blessings now hums with neutral silence. What some remember as unity, others remember as exclusion, and that contrast still lingers in how we define freedom today. A 1984 EPA survey found that approximately 35,000 American schools contained asbestos, putting 15 million students and 1.4 million staff members at risk of exposure. That was not an estimate. That was a direct count based on sampling 2,600 school districts. Asbestos had been built into ceiling tiles, floor tiles, pipe insulation, boiler rooms, cafeteria walls, and auditorium panels because the material was cheap, fireproof, and held structures together for decades. It also shed microscopic fibers every time a ceiling tile cracked, a pipe joint was bumped, or a janitor scraped the floor. National asbestos usage had peaked in 1973 at over 800,000 tons per year. Congress passed the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act in 1986, but the law required inspection and management, not removal. Schools were told to leave undamaged asbestos in place and monitor it. Few experiences from 1970s gym class were as invasive as the uniform check. Gym teachers demanded absolute conformity. Every student had to wear the exact school-issued shorts and shirts, no exceptions. Before class began, teachers would sometimes order students to line up and lift their shirts slightly or tug their shorts to show the waistband, proving they were wearing the correct outfit underneath. Some students froze in embarrassment, their faces burning as teachers walked the line. Others tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered long after class ended. The smell of sweat, the sound of whistles, and the echo of orders made those inspections feel like tiny military drills. If anyone forgot or substituted their own clothes, it meant detention or a lower grade. In some schools, girls were told to change in front of one another, and privacy barely existed. It was not just about uniforms, it was about control and compliance. Teachers believed enforcing sameness built unity, but it only built resentment and discomfort. For some students, those checks were humiliating and frightening, especially when teachers crossed personal boundaries in the name of discipline. Years later, those same rules feel unthinkable. What was once called routine inspection would now be recognized for what it truly was, an invasion of personal space that stripped students of both comfort and dignity. The metal slide at your school was a sheet of polished steel bolted to a frame standing 10 or 12 feet tall, anchored directly into concrete and completely exposed to the sun. By mid-afternoon in any state south of Ohio, that surface became a griddle. Temperatures on sun-baked steel could reach over 150 degrees, hot enough to cause contact burns on the backs of bare legs in seconds. Kids invented their own workarounds. They poured water down the chute, slid on wax paper stolen from lunchboxes, or simply launched themselves off the sides when the heat became unbearable. There were no plastic alternatives, no shade structures, and no heat-reducing coatings. The Consumer Product Safety Commission pushed for design changes, but most schools did not swap steel for molded plastic until the late 1990s. Fashion was rebellion in the 1970s, and for girls, something as simple as wearing pants could get them sent home. Many schools enforced strict dress codes requiring dresses or skirts below the knee. Jeans, slacks, or anything resembling male clothing were banned in the name of modesty. A girl wearing pants was often called disrespectful, even immoral. Yet it was also an era when women were fighting for equal rights outside the classroom, and school dress codes became a quiet battleground for that same fight. Some girls refused to change, others were suspended, and a few made local headlines for challenging the rules. When these codes finally started to fall away, it was not because schools suddenly became modern. It was because students refused to back down. What was once labeled inappropriate became a symbol of progress. Walk past the faculty lounge in any 1980s school and you could smell it before you reached the door. Cigarette smoke hung in visible layers above a coffee pot, a microwave, and a table covered in half-graded papers. Teachers smoked between periods, during planning time, and in some buildings, during staff meetings while discussing curriculum. A 1988 survey by the National School Boards Association, conducted alongside the American Cancer Society, found that many districts had no tobacco policy at all. In elementary schools without a dedicated lounge, teachers ducked behind the building or stepped into a hallway corner. When districts finally banned indoor smoking on campus, teachers moved to their cars in the parking lot, creating a daily ritual visible to every kid who looked out the window during class. Teachers lighting up inside classrooms sounds unbelievable today, but in the 1970s it was as common as chalk dust. Many teachers had ashtrays right on their desks and a lit cigarette balanced between their fingers while they lectured. Smoke curled around overhead projectors, and the air was thick by the end of the day. Students sat quietly, breathing it all in, not daring to complain. Some teachers even used cigarettes as part of their persona, the cool teacher with rolled-up sleeves and a cloud of smoke overhead. It symbolized authority and adulthood, not addiction. Looking back, it is astonishing how normalized it was to fill a room of children with secondhand smoke. What we now call dangerous was once seen as sophistication. The classroom might have been filled with lessons, but the air itself was toxic. When a glass thermometer broke in a 1980s science classroom, the lesson stopped and something far more interesting began. Mercury scattered across the lab table in tiny silver beads that rolled and merged when you pushed them together. Students poked the liquid metal with pencils, corralled it with index cards, and sometimes cupped it in the palms of their hands. Teachers treated it as a minor inconvenience. Someone wiped the table with a paper towel and class resumed. What nobody mentioned was that mercury vaporizes at room temperature into an invisible, odorless gas that accumulates in enclosed spaces. Between 2002 and 2006, American poison control centers received over 37,000 calls about children exposed to mercury, and more than 30,000 of those involved broken thermometers. A 2004 case in New Jersey found roughly 100 children exposed at a daycare center built inside a former thermometer factory. Public punishment in classrooms was another normal part of 1970s schooling, and nothing symbolized that better than the dunce chair. If you were caught daydreaming, laughing too loud, or falling behind, you could be made to sit at the front of the class facing the wall while everyone else stared. Sometimes teachers made kids wear a paper hat or hold a sign that said slow or lazy. Humiliation was a teaching tool, and students were told it would make them stronger. But the truth was, it made children terrified of making mistakes. Many adults still feel that pang of shame when they think about being singled out for something as small as a spelling error. The dunce chair was less about correction and more about control, a way to remind everyone watching what happens if you step out of line. Today, that kind of cruelty would never pass as education. The greatest moment in any 1980s classroom was the instant the lights went off and the teacher wheeled in the AV cart. A 16mm film projector sat on top, heavy as a cinder block, trailing a power cord that stretched across the floor like a tripwire. The projector ran hot. The bulb inside operated at temperatures high enough to melt the film if it jammed, and students trusted to thread the reel often had their fingers inches from exposed mechanical parts spinning at speed. Below the projector sat the overhead unit, built by 3M starting in the early 1960s and used by the military before it ever reached a school. Its glass surface could burn a hand flat. The fan motor hummed loud enough to drown out the teacher, and the entire setup plugged into a wall outlet that in most older buildings had not been rewired since the school was built. Appearance was everything, especially for girls. Teachers and administrators conducted random hair and makeup checks, deciding what was acceptable based on personal taste. Too much eyeliner, lipstick, or nail polish could get a girl sent home. Some schools even banned mascara altogether. Teachers would stand by mirrors or locker areas, pointing out excess makeup like it was a disciplinary issue. A smudge of eyeliner could turn into a lecture on morality, while chipped nail polish was labeled sloppy. For many young girls, getting ready for school felt less like preparation for class and more like preparing for judgment. The rule was that beauty should be natural, but what that really meant was controlled. Boys could be messy and scruffy, girls had to look clean, proper, and calm. These inspections turned self-expression into a source of anxiety. Many women who went to school then still remember the sting of a teacher's comment about their looks. The classroom mirror reflected not learning, but judgment, and it taught young girls that appearance mattered more than voice. Near the ceiling of every school gym, a thick braided rope hung from a steel hook, dangling 20 or more feet above a single mat so thin you could feel the hardwood floor through it. The gym teacher blew a whistle, and one by one students were expected to climb. No harness, no second mat. The spotter was usually a classmate whose attention lasted about 4 seconds. In 2013, the rope climb was inducted into the Physical Education Hall of Shame, described as a perfect storm of low participation, extreme danger, thin mats, inattentive spotters, rope burns on hands and legs, and the grand spectacle of one student struggling while an entire class sat and watched. For the handful who reached the top, the reward was a view of ceiling dust and exposed ductwork. For everyone else, the reward was shredded palms and a grade that punished them for having short arms. In the 1970s, teenage pregnancy was not seen as a challenge to support. It was a problem to remove. Pregnant students were often forced out of school, told they would set a bad example. Some were sent to secret special schools, while others simply disappeared from classrooms one day. Administrators claimed it was to protect the school's reputation, not the student's future. Friends would whisper, teachers would avoid the subject, and an entire chapter of a young woman's life would be erased under the word shame. These girls were denied the right to graduate alongside their classmates or to continue their studies at all. The idea that motherhood and education could coexist was unthinkable to many at the time. It was a cold reflection of how society valued appearances more than compassion. Looking back, this rule did more than hide pregnancies. It hid humanity. Gym teachers in the 1980s had a name for dodgeball that told you everything about how it was played. They called it murder ball. Two teams lined up on opposite sides of the gymnasium, and the rubber balls between them were not the soft foam versions sold today. They were hard, dense, and designed for kickball, with a surface that left raised welts on bare skin and enough weight to turn a close-range throw into something closer to assault. Hit someone, they sat down. Get hit, your dignity went with you. In 2013, the Journal of Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance inducted dodgeball into its Hall of Shame, alongside Red Rover and the rope climb. But the original version was worse. A 1922 guide published by Junior ROTC described a variation where the outer team threw medicine balls, weighing 7 to 12 pounds, at kids trapped in the center of the circle. Hair became another target of control, especially for boys. If your hair touched your collar or ears, you risked suspension or public humiliation. Principals would walk the halls with rulers, checking length against the dress code. Long hair was seen as a threat, a sign of rebellion, nonconformity, or even moral weakness. Some schools kept scissors in the office to fix violations on the spot. For many students, hair became a quiet protest against authority, a way to express individuality when few other options existed. Parents argued with schools, but change came slowly. The hair wars of the 1970s were about more than style. They were about identity, freedom, and the right to be different in a system built to make everyone the same. Every school bus in the 1980s was a 40-foot steel box with vinyl bench seats, no seat belts, and a single rearview mirror that could not cover half the passengers. The federal safety standard, FMVSS 222, relied on a concept called compartmentalization, meaning seats were packed close together with padded high backs so that in a crash, students would theoretically be contained between the rows. That theory assumed every child sat upright and faced forward. In practice, kids stood in the aisle, sat sideways, knelt backward on seats, and threw objects across the bus at highway speed. The National Transportation Safety Board recommended lap and shoulder belts for school buses multiple times over the decades. States declined, citing retrofit costs that would run into the billions. As of today, only a handful of states require three-point belts on new large school buses. Corporal punishment was not just allowed in the 1970s, it was expected. Teachers and principals kept wooden paddles hanging behind their desks, ready for anyone who talked back, forgot homework, or got caught chewing gum. One wrong move could mean a trip to the office where a wooden board, sometimes with holes drilled in it to make the sting worse, would be used in front of other students. Parents rarely objected, and most schools saw it as building character. Students learned early that fear kept order more than respect did. The sound of a paddle striking wood or desk was enough to quiet a whole hallway. Many adults who went to school then still remember that mix of embarrassment, fear, and anger, not the lesson that came after. Looking back now, it is hard to believe this was ever called discipline. It was control disguised as morality, and it left a generation who learned more about silence than self-expression. In September of 1981, the Reagan administration proposed new rules for the National School Lunch Program that would have allowed ketchup to count as a vegetable serving. The proposal came from the USDA's Food and Nutrition Service, which had been ordered to cut $1 billion from child nutrition funding and given 90 days to figure out how. Their solution included reducing portion sizes, allowing pickle relish to substitute for a vegetable, and permitting soybean curd to replace meat. Budget Director David Stockman later called it a bureaucratic goof and said the Agriculture Department had not only egg on its face, but ketchup too. Senate Democrats staged a photo op where they ate the proposed mini-meals on camera. Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia held up a bottle and noted that ketchup was now a vegetable. The rules were withdrawn within 15 days, and the USDA administrator who wrote them was reassigned 2 days before Thanksgiving. But the funding cuts went ahead anyway, and over 3 million students dropped out of the lunch program. Patriotism was mandatory in the 1970s classroom. Every morning began with the Pledge of Allegiance, and refusing to stand was seen as an act of defiance. Students who stayed seated or silent could face detention, suspension, or even expulsion. It was less about love of country and more about enforcing obedience. Some kids quietly mouthed the words to avoid punishment, while others looked down at their desks, hearts pounding in defiance they could not voice. A few brave ones refused entirely, sparking whispers, outrage, or even calls to their parents. Those moments turned a daily routine into a test of loyalty no child should have had to face. Teachers were expected to report disrespectful students, and principals treated it like insubordination. Few questioned whether forcing loyalty was loyalty at all. Many children recited the words automatically, their voices blending into a rhythm they never truly thought about. Decades later, the idea of punishing someone for silent protest feels completely un-American, yet that was the daily reality. The 1970s may have looked free and expressive on the surface, but inside the classroom, conformity was law. Before anyone worried about what kids were breathing in science class, some schools had already solved a different problem by giving students a dedicated place to inhale something worse. If you attended high school in the early 1980s, your campus may have had a designated smoking area where students could light a cigarette between classes without fear of detention. At Cheyenne East High in Wyoming, the class of 1983 remembered multiple spots, including a courtyard by the cafeteria and a path from the boys' locker room to the parking lot. In Minnesota, one district installed a school-sanctioned smoking bathroom, reasoning it was better to contain the habit than let students destroy every lavatory in the building. Most of these smokers were 14 to 18 years old. By September of 1981, districts started reversing course, stationing police near campuses to ticket underage smokers. For years before that, lighting up at school was not rebellion, it was infrastructure. Discipline in the 1970s could take strange and terrifying forms, and one of the harshest was the principal's office lock-in. When students misbehaved or needed to cool down, some principals would place them in small storage rooms or supply closets, alone, in silence, sometimes in the dark. There were no cameras, no supervision, just fear. The student might stay there for minutes or hours depending on the mood of the principal. Teachers and parents rarely questioned it because they trusted authority. The sound of the door shutting was unforgettable, a heavy click that meant you were completely alone. The air smelled of cleaning supplies and dust, and the longer you sat there, the smaller the room felt. Every creak outside the door made your heart race, wondering if someone was coming back or if they had forgotten you entirely. To the staff, it was a practical way to maintain control. To the kids, it was punishment through isolation. Many remember sitting on the cold floor, hearing the muffled sound of typewriters and voices outside, wondering when someone would come back. For a child, that kind of solitude could feel endless. It is hard to imagine any educator defending that now, yet at the time it was accepted as normal discipline. What adults once called cooling off looks more like psychological cruelty in hindsight. If what was inside the walls was not bad enough, what coated them made it worse. Lead-based paint was banned for residential use in 1978, but nobody came to scrape it off school walls. Buildings constructed before that year, which covered the vast majority of American public schools, kept their original coatings for years and sometimes decades. When the paint cracked and peeled, it created chips and fine dust that settled on windowsills, desks, and floors where young hands touched every surface. The danger extended past the classroom. Drinking fountains in older buildings ran through lead service lines and brass spigots that leached the metal directly into the water. The Safe Drinking Water Act was not amended to address lead in plumbing until 1986. The EPA did not mandate lead abatement regulations for school buildings until 1998, 20 years after the residential ban. Gym class in the 1970s was not just about push-ups or running laps. It was about public humiliation disguised as fitness. Students lined up in front of their classmates to be weighed, their numbers recorded out loud by teachers holding clipboards. The scale sat in the corner of every gym like a silent judge, and no one could escape its verdict. Fitness progress was what they called it, but it was really a ritual of comparison. Kids whispered, laughed, or cringed as each name was called. No one questioned why it mattered how much a child weighed, only that lighter meant better. For many, this was their first lesson in body shame, long before social media ever existed. Teachers claimed it built discipline, but it mostly built anxiety, especially for those who already felt different. Students still remember the metallic click of that scale, the scratch of pen against paper, and the eyes that followed them back to the bench. In a place meant to build confidence, self-worth was measured in pounds. Looking back, it is easy to see how cruel those moments really were. In 1977, the Supreme Court ruled in Ingraham v. Wright that hitting a student with a wooden paddle did not qualify as cruel and unusual punishment. The case involved a Florida junior high student who was restrained by his assistant principal and struck more than 20 times, hard enough to require medical attention. The court ruled 5-4 that the Eighth Amendment applied only to convicted criminals, not to kids in public schools. That decision shaped the entire decade. By the early 1980s, 4% of all American students were paddled each year. The Board of Education in Pickens County, Alabama, published specifications for the recommended paddle, 24 inches long, 3 inches wide, and half an inch thick. The Society for Adolescent Medicine estimated that between 10,000 and 20,000 students needed medical treatment annually as a result. Most were paddled for talking in class, dress code violations, or running in the hallway. One of the most common rules in 1970s classrooms was also one of the most unforgiving: no bathroom breaks without permission. Once class began, the door might as well have been locked. Teachers treated restroom requests as acts of rebellion, and many students learned to simply hold it in. Some would squirm quietly in their seats, eyes glued to the clock, praying for the bell. Others risked asking and endured public scolding that left them humiliated in front of everyone. The rule made something natural feel like a moral failure, and children learned to fear asking for help. Those who could not were met with scolding, shame, or even detention. It did not matter if you were sick, nervous, or desperate. Leaving without a signed slip meant disrespecting authority. Some teachers even believed denying bathroom breaks built discipline and focus. But for the children on the receiving end, it built fear and humiliation. Many remember sitting at their desks, counting the minutes, their stomachs in knots. A few could not wait, and those incidents haunted them for years. What was seen as order and control now reads as cruelty. Denying a child basic human needs was never about education, it was about power. The federal government could not even keep ketchup off the vegetable list, so it should come as no surprise that nobody was regulating the merry-go-round. The steel platform sat low to the ground, bolted to a center post over concrete or packed dirt, with grab bars that were either too hot from the sun or too slick from rain. There were no speed limiters, no friction brakes, and no way to stop the thing once the biggest kid in the group got it spinning. The centrifugal force launched riders sideways off the edge and onto whatever surface the district had poured underneath, which was usually asphalt. In 1995, McDonald's was forced to finance a $5 million child safety campaign after the Consumer Product Safety Commission determined that merry-go-rounds were responsible for 104 documented injuries during the 1980s alone. Lawsuits in New Jersey and other states eventually made officials too nervous to keep them, and the platforms were ripped out by the dozens. Cafeterias in the 1970s had their own set of unspoken laws, and one of the worst was the clean plate rule. Children were told they could not leave the lunch table until every bite was gone. It did not matter if the food was cold, mushy, or nauseating. Wasting food was a sin, teachers said, especially when kids in other countries are starving. Supervisors patrolled the aisles, watching trays closely, and those who hesitated were scolded. Kids learned tricks, spreading food thinly to make it look eaten, hiding vegetables under napkins, or trading unwanted bites to friends who were hungrier or braver. The cafeteria became a quiet battlefield between appetite and authority, and everyone had their own small rebellion. Years later, many adults realized they still cleaned their plates out of habit, not hunger, a lesson they never asked to learn. Some kids tried hiding peas under napkins or sneaking food into milk cartons, but they usually got caught. The rule was meant to teach gratitude, but it often taught disgust. Many children developed unhealthy relationships with food, learning to eat even when full or to associate meals with pressure and guilt. For a generation, the school lunchroom was not just noisy and chaotic. It was a small theater of forced obedience. Today, the idea of punishing a child for refusing to eat would be unthinkable. But back then, finishing your plate was not just expected, it was mandatory. Under federal labor law, minors are prohibited from operating power-driven woodworking tools in the workplace. Table saws, bandsaws, lathes, routers, and jointers are all explicitly banned for workers under 18 by the U.S. Department of Labor. But that rule applied only to employment. In school shop class, students as young as 11 years old used that same equipment every week. A Utah statewide study of school injuries between 1992 and 1996 found that 7% of all student injuries happened in shop class, and nearly half of the equipment-related cases involved saws. Table saws and bandsaws each accounted for 12 to 15% of shop injuries. Equipment was being misused in roughly 38% of cases. The safety gear was whatever the teacher had available, which in many districts meant a pair of scratched goggles and a reminder to keep your fingers clear of the blade. Believe it or not, smoking was part of school culture. Many high schools had official smoking areas outdoors, complete with benches and ashtrays. Teachers would supervise or even join in during breaks. It was considered normal, a way to relax between classes. Cigarette companies marketed heavily to teens, and schools did little to discourage it. The smell of tobacco hung in hallways, on clothes, even in gym lockers. Parents accepted it as a phase, unaware of the health risks we now take for granted. By the late 1970s, as public health campaigns grew, these smoking courts began to disappear. But for years, they stood as a reminder that even in a place meant for learning, bad habits were sanctioned by the system itself. They called it recess. The equipment called it something else entirely. Hit subscribe if this one brought something back.